The millennium, when people speak of the millennium, they're referring to the 1,000-year period that's depicted in Revelation 20. Now, the premillennial view says that Jesus will come back before the 1,000 years. The 1,000 years is future. And some people think that certain prophecies from the Old Testament about the lion and the lamb lying together and so on will be fulfilled during that period, although Revelation 20 doesn't really specify that. You'd need a whole lot of millennia actually to harmonize all the different symbolic images. The amillennial view today normally means that the millennium is taken as symbolic for the whole course of this present age of reigning with Christ symbolically. The postmillennial view is essentially that we will establish God's kingdom on earth. The good news will be proclaimed among all the nations before the end comes, and so on. We'll set up things, and then Christ will return after we've basically established his throne for him. The millennium is future, and Christ comes back at the end of that 1,000 years. Now, associated with this often is discussion in popular discourse about the tribulation, where people who are premillennial hold different views on whether the church is taken out before the tribulation, which is the premillennial view, caught up to meet the Lord in the air before the tribulation, or mid-tribulational, that is caught up to meet the Lord in the middle of the tribulation, although actually in Revelation, unless you add the period which is mentioned more than once together multiple times, the tribulation is only 3.5 years. And it may be a symbolic 3.5 years for something else. But in any case, if you add all the 3.5-year periods together, you come up with more than 7 years. And then the post-tribulational view is that the Lord comes back at the end of the tribulation, and we're caught up to meet him on his way down to rule the earth. And all of those are potentially premillennial views. The post-tribulational view is also compatible with amillennialism. So that's just a summary of what the views are. Revelation 20 is a chapter that's much debated, primarily because it includes the millennium, which is much debated among different groups of Christians. So we're going to look at some of the options that Christians through history have preferred. Well, what's your preferred option? Premillennial, amillennial, postmillennial? Some people prefer panmillennial, saying it'll pan out in the end. Or amillennial, that's the modern one. Historical views. The earliest church fathers seem to have expected a literal future 1,000 years. Papias said that the Apostle John promised a material future agricultural paradise. He's quoted to that effect in Irenaeus. Justin Martyr spoke of a literal future 1,000 years in the rebuilt Jerusalem after the resurrection of the dead. Justin does, however, admit that some Christians in his day held other views. Irenaeus warns against allegorizing prophecies in Revelation. Of course, we have a lot of symbolic images in Revelation. Amillennialism. By the 4th century, Eusebius argued that nearly all Christian leaders assumed that they were in the millennium, and that some premillennialists were thus able to be shown their error. Well, what changed? In the earlier period, Christians believed that they were either in the tribulation or about to experience it. But when Constantine legalized Christianity and made it a tolerated religion, and eventually it became even the official religion of the empire, they went from seeing themselves as a persecuted sect within the Roman Empire to seeing themselves as reigning with Christ through the person of the Roman Empire. There have been a number of famous amillennialists through history, people like Augustine, Luther, and Calvin. So if you're from a premillennial tradition, you don't want to say, hey, look, if you're amillennial, you must be a heretic, unless you want to call Augustine, Luther, and Calvin heretics. And conversely, if you're amillennial, you probably don't want to call premillennialists heretics, lest you call Justin Martyr and Irenaeus heretics. The earlier amillennial views generally started the millennium with the time of Constantine. And 1,000 years later, people were expecting the final judgment. 1,000 years after Constantine, hey, the millennium is about up now. And then they realized, maybe it's symbolic. The world hasn't come to an end. But even today, few people would say that persecutions have stopped. In many parts of the world, persecutions, even to the point of death, remain a live issue. So today, amillennialism tends to have a different approach. And some of that earlier amillennial approach even can be understood as sort of postmillennial. Amillennialism today, and through some other parts of history, sees the millennium as the period between the first and the second comings. So when it speaks of the first resurrection, it's speaking of the saints being spiritually raised with Christ. Or in one possible view, you get it when you die. Well, this is similar to what we argued for the tribulation. It's another side of the coin, if you take this view. On this view, saints are still getting martyred, but remember, they're overcoming. So they're reigning with Christ as a kingdom and priests. The millennium, therefore, would be a repetition of the tribulation period that we've seen over and over again earlier in the book of Revelation. So from a systematic theological standpoint, this is a neat way to wrap it all up, because we don't have to figure out where there's a millennium elsewhere in the Bible. We can just say, well, we don't see it anywhere else, and this makes Revelation 20 fit in with the rest of the New Testament pretty easily. Premillennialists, however, point out some problems with this approach. The binding of Satan, chapter 20, verses 2 and 3, doesn't seem to match Satan's present activity coming down to the earth with great wrath in 12:12 to 13 and 13:11 to 15. Also, if you look at the chronological flow of the text, the saints have already been martyred before Revelation 20. That's why they get resurrected. They've already been beheaded. Also, the beast and the false prophet appear to be already in the lake of fire for 1,000 years after Armageddon in chapter 20 and verse 10. The resurrection of the righteous is parallel to and contrasted with that of the rest of the dead, the wicked, who return to life after the 1,000 years are over. And since the second death probably refers to them being raised so they can be cast into the lake of fire, it suggests a bodily rather than a symbolic resurrection, hence a future bodily resurrection rather than the past new birth. Now, the language live again could go either way, as if you look through the rest of the New Testament. Another argument against the Amillennial view is that in hindsight, we recognize that the period between the first and second comings, well, it's been even longer than 1,000 years. But in John's day, that could have seemed too long, because most people interpret soon, not just as imminent, but they're expecting it right away. Postmillennialism, but by the way, we'll come back and give arguments against premillennialism later. I'm going to try to do this as even-handedly as possible to give you all the views, arguments for and against. Postmillennialism believes in a future millennium, or possibly you're in the millennium now, but it started at some time in the past, preferably recent past. But like amillennialists, they believe that the second coming is at the end of the millennium. This view was apparently held by Wesley. It was held by Jonathan Edwards, by Charles Finney, by most 19th century born-again Christians in the United States. Now, the optimism that went with postmillennialism helped fuel evangelism, missions, the anti-slavery crusade, the temperance crusade, which didn't turn out quite so well, but it was shattered in the reefs of reality with World War I, just like its secular counterpart, Manifest Destiny in the U.S. and liberalism, the old school liberalism or modernism that saw the world just getting better and humanity evolving socially so that we would get past all the wars and so forth. Well, World War I shattered that in Europe. And Barth, that's when he came up with the neo-orthodoxy, moving away from the old school 19th century liberal views. And many Christians in the United States moved away from postmillennialism to a form of premillennialism that was much more pessimistic about the future. Postmillennialism has been making a comeback in some circles today, but it's still nowhere close to a dominant view. Premillennialism's second coming. There were people throughout the Middle Ages who were premillennial, and there were, even though most people were amillennial, there were people like Isaac Newton. If you read his commentary on Daniel and so forth, Isaac Newton was premillennial. But premillennialism especially began making a comeback in the 1800s. John Nelson Darby was a major force in this. In 1830, he came up with dispensational premillennialism. Now, dispensational premillennialism in Darby's day was different from what we call progressive dispensationalism today. So, Charles Ryrie, the Ryrie Study Bible, moved somewhat away from that, and today we have progressive dispensationalists who've moved quite far from that. Darby's view, people in the Old Testament were saved by works. People today are saved by grace. The book of Acts was an intermediate period. Things were being phased out then. And the old joke about this was the child who comes home with a black eye who got in a fight, and the mother says, well, why did you get in a fight? Well, he hit me first. Don't you know you're supposed to turn the other cheek? Ma, that's only for the Jews, because certain things were considered only for Israel. Darby wanted to make a clear distinction between Israel and the church and say God only works with Israel during this period, only works with the church in a different period. Of course, since 1948, many people have thought that to be an arbitrary dichotomy. But in any case, this was just one form of premillennialism. The classical or historic form of premillennialism, which believed the church was in the tribulation or would go through the tribulation, also persisted, although the dispensational premillennialism was particularly dominant in the early 20th century, spread especially through the Scofield Reference Bible. Now, premillennialism fits Revelation pretty well. It fits the chronology of Revelation 20 very well. But there are problems with premillennialism also. It's hard to find the millennium elsewhere in the New Testament. I looked for it. I tried to find it in 1 Corinthians 15, where George Eldon Ladd, who was a historic premillennialist, found it. And I just cannot, it doesn't make good exegetical sense in 1 Corinthians 15. Passage after passage speaks of everything wrapping up at Christ's return. For example, the heavens passing away with a great noise, which doesn't leave much room for a tribulation. Amillennialists say, better to take all the other passages literally, and this one passage in a symbolic book with lots of symbolic numbers, symbolically. And the premillennial response would be, well, you've got progressive revelation. Revelation 20 gives us more details that you didn't have earlier. So the premillennial and amillennial views both have reasons for which people hold them. And I think it's important that we know those so that we can respect our brothers and sisters who hold different views. In fact, often we are taught only the views that originated in our tradition. Many of the church movements that started in the early 20th century, in the heyday of dispensational premillennialism, are dispensational premillennialists. And many of the churches that started in earlier periods of amillennial dominance teach amillennialism. And it's not really something we need to fight about when we look at how God blessed people who held all sorts of different views, including postmillennialists, how God used them. It's just one chapter. We don't have to break fellowship over the interpretation of one chapter. Jewish millennial views. Many believed in a transitional intermediate kingdom between this age and the age to come. Is it possible that Revelation simply adapts this as a literary device? Now, that piece of background can be used either way. Premillennialists can say, it's a literary device, but It was an understood literary device, so we know what it signifies, an intermediate kingdom. Amillennialists can say, well, no, it's just a literary device. It's not talking about a literal millennium. So again, it can be argued either way. In any case, what we can see is God wins. And if I just had Revelation 20, I would probably be a premillennialist. If I were a systematic theologian trying to harmonize it with the rest of the New Testament, I would probably be an amillennialist. What am I? It doesn't matter. Figure out for yourself which view you hold. Just be nice to people who hold different views. The Great White Throne Judgment, chapter 20, verses 11 through 15. In verse 11, the old creation fled from before his face. And it speaks of the books recording all people's deeds. And it speaks especially of the book of life that we've seen elsewhere, earlier in the book of Revelation, that those who overcome will not be erased from the book of life. Death and Hades and all the dead who are not found in the book of life, however, are ultimately thrown into the lake of fire. Coming back to this idea that the old creation fled from his face, is that talking about creation literally vanishing, or does it get transformed? Well, that's a debate that comes up when we read about the new heavens and the new earth in chapter 21.